When I think about the history of racism, one of the most insidious outgrowths of racism has been genocide. To witness the ways in which you had these Zionist voices justifying the genocide of Palestinians with racist ideas in forms that look so familiar to what had happened to other groups of peoples of color around the world, to not say anything, to me, it's just unthinkable.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time zone you're living in, it's time for Sumud. All about humanity, so this right here for everyone. Uplift, amplify, empower everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time zone you're living in, it's time for Sumud.
On this episode of the Sumud Podcast, we uplift, empower, and amplify Dr. Ibram X. Kendi. Dr. Kendi is one of the most influential thinkers on race today. He is known for his fearless scholarship, powerful storytelling, and ability to challenge long-held narratives. A best-selling author, he has shaped a national conversation on racism by emphasizing that anti-racism requires action, not just awareness. I am your host, Ed Hasan. My co-host, Zaina, is traveling. Visit sumudpod.com to subscribe to the podcast and connect with us on social media. Dr. Kendi, welcome.
It's a pleasure to be. Thank you for having me on.
I know you're busy. Just for our guests to know, we are honored to have Dr. Kendi here today. I know we have a very short amount of time, but we appreciate every minute that you give us. The first question I have for you, rumor has it that you have a notebook that reminds you to write things that you are grateful for. What are you grateful for today?
I'm not necessarily somebody who is, big on Valentine's Day, but, certainly many people are celebrating Valentine's Day. And so I certainly am grateful for the people who have attempted to love me, and certainly grateful for, the people in my life who have attempted to love, and really even grateful for really all of the activists and revolutionaries and change makers who are fueled by love. I think they inspire me each day, and I'm grateful for them.
And when did you start this habit of writing what you're grateful for every day? At what point did you start that?
I may have started, I believe, around 2020. And I think I started then because I think at the same time, my work was becoming more and more part of the sort of national, international conversation. As a result, I was also facing a lot of sort of hate mail and all sorts of attacks. In the midst of such a situation, it could become easy to focus on the people or, forms of power that are trying to destroy you, who are not happy, about your work. And so I think it sort of forced me to each day situate myself in all the people and all the organizations and the forces who I'm grateful for, who even in turn are probably grateful for my work as well.
And we're definitely going to hopefully discuss some of the challenges that you've had and all of the hate that has come your way. But we got your back here, just so you know, we're with you. Talk to me a little bit about growing up. You had mentioned in one of your interviews that you had escaped what Toni Morrison called the white gaze, to see the world through the white gaze. How did that impact you growing up and how you sort of viewed yourself? Because I think at one point you even thought that you were just a bad student because of your race, possibly?
Yeah, so, growing up in New York City, in Queens, in the 1980s and 1990s, my parents were not necessarily those who would speak, let's say, ill of Black people. They were parents who came out of the Black Power movement, particularly Black theology movement. But at the same time, I was growing and coming of age in a society that looked upon Black people, particularly Black youth in the 90s, as a menace to society, as super predators, valuing clothes and music and shoes over education. And so whenever I would mess up, it would be easy to blame myself or even my group, that, I was in a way the problem because Black youth are the problem, because the world keeps telling me Black youth are the problem, particularly the white world, particularly white Americans. And so I started to look at myself in certain moments in the ways that white Americans were looking at me as a problem, particularly when I would make mistakes without necessarily knowing that to be human is to make mistakes. And so I've come a long way, so to speak.
If you could go back to your younger self when you were growing up, what would you tell yourself?
Well, I would tell myself that the only thing wrong with Black people is that we think something is wrong with Black people, that there's nothing wrong with us as a group. There's certainly nothing wrong with Black youth, that when you make mistakes, that signals that you made a mistake. That doesn't signal that there's something wrong with you as a person or that there's something wrong with Black people. I would tell myself that I'm not a representative of Black people, that the race isn't on my shoulder. I would tell myself to read books and listen to people who are trying to document the anti-Black racism that is actually affecting my life that I may not be able to see, particularly the sort of invisible structure of policies and practices, so that I can begin presumably seeing them and seeing how they're impacting my life, particularly in places where I'm thinking I'm the problem. I would encourage myself to explore more about other groups and about other cultures, particularly those who are facing similar forms of oppression and degradation.
And when did the pivot happen for you, that sort of aha moment? Was it in college that you realized, wait a minute, this is a systems issue. This is not a me issue.
It was definitely in college at FAMU when I started taking classes in African-American studies, particularly African-American history. And my professor, Dr. Jackson, his chronicling of African-American history was largely a chronicling of these larger structural forces and how they impacted Black people. I certainly had learned about Black history, but my learnings about Black history before those classes was more or less a contribution history. These are the individuals who, quote unquote, contributed to America. I didn't really receive a structural analysis, until college.
You'd mentioned that you wore contact lenses. Was that more of a fashion statement or more of a form of covering?
Probably a little bit of both. Certainly in the early 21st century, color contacts were somewhat of a fad, particularly among people of color. And so it was certainly on one hand a fashion statement. On the other hand, I did not fully believe that my eye color was attractive, or I thought that having lighter eyes would allow me to look better. And so in getting, color contacts, particularly honey contacts, I thought that this would allow me to look more attractive because I imagined that the lighter one's eyes, the better one looked, just as Black people are taught the lighter our skin, the better we look. I realized that in a way I had internalized, colorist ideas.
That's very similar to the Arab community as well. I'm sure you're aware, the lighter you are, the prettier or more handsome you are as well. So I can appreciate that challenge. So did you know growing up and thinking about your younger days and then college that you would be where you are today, one of the most influential individuals in academia?
No, I was a basketball head. So I love basketball. I dreamed of playing in the NBA, spent most of my time on the court, and I rarely read books. I think I had a political consciousness that I think was largely developed through hip hop. But I think as it relates to being a voracious reader and writer and thinker and encouraging people to transform larger structures in society, I would have never imagined me doing that or becoming that.
Who's your team?
New York Knicks.
New York Knicks. I'm sorry to hear that. A lot of pain. I feel it. I feel it through this screen here. So, serious question for you. How does it feel to live rent-free in Ted Cruz's head?
It's interesting because it both feels fitting, in that, Ted Cruz is a longtime defender of racism in the United States. At the same time, it can create all sorts of challenges, right? Because if you live rent-free in the minds of, people who can create sort of internet mobs to try to delegitimate and destroy you, it just makes life harder. At the same time, those of us who are engaged in this work, challenging racism, challenging classism, challenging Islamophobia, challenging sexism, this is part of the job. And to a certain extent, we know we're doing the right job when people who are defending those forms of bigotry are attacking us.
Yeah, I mean, even to the extent where they were banning your books, I believe, in libraries too. There's this debate about you that you've oversimplified the notion of what racism is and what it is not, and suggesting that it's binary, right? Either you're a racist or an anti-racist. I would ask, do you feel that criticism is because they are scared that you've made it so simple and it forces people to look in the mirror and be held accountable for their actions?
Yes. I would also just add to that when you actually track the history of racism, and particularly the history of defining racism, you see those who are defending racism or conserving racism constantly seeking to muddy our conception of racism, right? Because it makes sense, right? If you want to defend or conserve racism, you're not going to want people to know what it is. You're going to want to muddle and muddy sort of the water so people can't see you or see the structure you've created and see racism. I think what's also happened is there's sort of two perspectives in academia. One perspective is that the more everyday people can understand the work, the less intellectual it is. So that perspective obviously then leads academics to produce writings that the vast majority of people, including academics, can't really understand. And that allows that academic to imagine that their work is highly, quote unquote, academic or highly intellectual. Then you have another group of academics, which I consider myself to be a part of, who believes it's our job to translate our academic findings into language that everyday people can understand. That it's our job to clarify. And if regular folks can't understand, we're the problem, not those folks. And because frankly, if we're creating scholarship to help humanity, it makes no sense for humanity to not be able to use it, to better their lives. So I'm part of that camp. And unfortunately, I think the other camp typically critiques those scholars who are clarifying their work for regular people as, quote, oversimplifying. And I think there's a difference between clarifying and oversimplifying. And there's a way to hold the complexity in language that regular people know. This perspective that regular folks are dumb, which I don't have. To me, it's just you have to use language people use. But if you have a perspective that people are dumb and people can't understand racism, then you're not even going to attempt to try to figure out the language that their people are using and sort of clarify it and translate it in that way. Before my work pushed into trying to get us to think a different way, there was a binary. It was racist and not racist. Like that was the binary. And if you ask most people, how do you define not racist? They would say, I have no idea. So there was already a binary. Most people couldn't define racist or not racist. I argued, no, actually, the real binary is racist and anti-racist. And here are the clear and accessible definitions for both. You had people who were like, no, you're introducing a binary, who before that considered themselves to be not racist, right? And so to me, it's just deeply hypocritical because people are pushing to return to a binary that nobody understands, as opposed to one that clearly sort of defines what it means to be racist and anti-racist.
And you actually called yourself a racist as well. You own that at some point where you were able to unpack that. And again, I think that level of sincerity and honesty scares people. I don't know, when you were doing your research and when you were writing all this great stuff, I wondered, did you know you were exposing something deeply wrong with the system? That you were going to expose the Ted Cruzes of the world, essentially? That they are going to say, oh no, he's exposed us. He's oversimplified this. He put it into words that everybody's going to understand. We're all in trouble now.
I don't think I fully did. And I think to a certain extent, it may be helpful to not fully understand or even think about the implications of one's work when you're producing it and you're researching it, because that can even impact how you write it or what you state. So no, I didn't fully grasp those implications, but I did know that it was incredibly hard for me to acknowledge the ways in which I had been racist, particularly towards Black people, the ways in which I had internalized anti-Black racist ideas, particularly against certain Black groups. And so I knew that if it was hard for me to acknowledge that, I would have loved to hide behind this sort of denialism that quote unquote Black people can't be racist. Then I would imagine that any other person of color who feels like they can say whatever they want about Black people or Arab people or Latinx people or Asian people and still walk away and say they're not racist, it's probably going to be hard for them to.
Being racist or being anti-racist, is it a static state or does one or can one oscillate between the two depending on the situation?
I'm happy you asked this because one of the things that is incredibly frustrating is people sort of take the terms racist and anti-racist, apply their own conceptions to those terms, and then critique it, feeling as if they're critiquing me. The reason why I mention this is because, to your question, I argue and show that racist and anti-racist are not fixed categories. These are descriptive terms that describe what a person is being in any given moment. And so a person can be racist one moment, arguing that, Black people are dangerous, and anti-racist the next moment, pushing back against policies that would increase resource inequities between schools. The same person. And I think that actually demonstrates the complexity of the human experience, not this static concept of I am racist always or I'm not racist always. And so actually, I would argue the general framing of fixed, static, racist or not racist is very, very simple and frankly doesn't reflect the complexity of human beings.
Do you think that October 7th exposed those individuals who said that they were anti-racist and clearly maybe they weren't fully anti-racist, if you will?
I do. And I specifically think it exposed those people who, they may be anti-racist towards Asians or Black people, but they're certainly not anti-racist potentially towards Palestinians or even Muslims or even people of Arab descent. And that really talks again about the complexity, right? To be anti-racist is to recognize the equality and humanity of all groups, all peoples, no matter who they are, no matter where they are, and is to be willing to push back against anyone, no matter the context, who tries to describe a group of people as, quote, human animals.
Yeah. So then what is the impetus for somebody to be an anti-racist? What is going to motivate them? So I'm thinking somebody in Deep South, rural area, has no idea what the rest of the world is like, but they have these sort of mental models of colors of good and bad, if you will. What's going to motivate somebody to become an anti-racist?
So let's talk about somebody, let's say a white male in the rural American South who is lower middle class. Chances are that white male lives in a state that has one of the worst educational and healthcare systems in the United States. Chances are that lower middle income white rural man can't unionize. Chances are that that white male receives more wages than let's say his Black or brown counterpart, but he's still being exploited, because of who's controlling that state or even who's controlling that company. I mention all of that because I think it's very important for us, when I say us, those of us who are against racism, to document the ways in which, let's say, white people benefit relative to people of color from racism. I mean, and that's clear as day in terms of when we look at racial disparities and inequities. But I don't think we should then say to particularly low and middle income white people that an anti-racist society, they're going to lose. So it's just going to be a complete loss. No, they will lose privilege. They'll lose those benefits, but they'll actually gain in totality. To give an example, if you have a Black and a brown and a white person working at a factory and the white person's making $25 an hour and the Black and brown person is working $18 an hour, and the factory owner could be paying all of them $40 an hour, but has divided the white and Black and brown worker. And the white worker is like, hey, you know what? I'm better off than the Black and brown worker because of racism. That white worker doesn't realize he could actually be even better if he was able to eliminate what's actually dividing him from other people within the working class. And I think that's one of the insidious ways in which racism has operated, particularly in the United States, in which it's really divided working people. It's really divided everyday people. It's really caused white people to not recognize how much they could gain if we actually truly had an equitable society.
Yeah, no, certainly. And I appreciate that. I hope I get this right, but you had mentioned one time that history is not an arc bending toward justice, but a war of dueling forces, racist and anti-racist, that each escalates their response when the other advances. Would you say right now, in this very moment, that we're seeing that?
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing the progression of racism. We're seeing racist progress. We're seeing an administration who is arguing that efforts to diversify and even include different groups of people are in fact efforts to divide and exclude people. And this is a more sophisticated way to conserve or grow racism than earlier efforts. And so what I try to sort of show in my work is that racist policies and ideas become more sophisticated over time. And we're living in a moment whereby you have powerful forces that are seeking to conserve racism, that is saying they are acting on behalf of American civil rights, that they are the ones who are under attack, that they are the ones who are the victims of terror, as opposed to the way in which they're terrorizing the people.
I mean, I think I'm just surprised that still till this day, it's so overt. I mean, I was listening to the news the other day, or I saw a clip of somebody on Fox News, I believe, not the greatest example, but on Fox News saying Palestinians are uneducated. They have 5-6 babies per year, whatever the commentary was. I'm surprised that it's so in your face at this point. I mean, I know it's been in our face in different subtle ways, depending on where you are and your community, but this is really straight up in your face, no question asked. Does that surprise you?
It doesn't surprise me now, largely because when those who are expressing those racist ideas about Palestinians have positioned themselves with their supporters as quote unquote not racist, as quote unquote fighting racism, it creates a position for them to essentially say anything dehumanizing and then try to wear the cape of humanitarianism. And I think that's what makes it so insidious. And what's actually striking, particularly as a student of anti-Black racist ideas, is Black Americans have long heard that we, quote unquote, are uneducated. We don't care about education. We're having too many babies. And so what's been also fascinating for me, and even to a certain extent shocking, is the ways, particularly in the American context, that long-standing anti-Black racist ideas are echoing in racist ideas about Palestinian Americans. And what's shocking to me is that more Black Americans are not seeing those parallels and recognizing thereby that they're all coming from the same parent, that even though some have tried to distinguish Zionism from racism, there really is no difference.
Yeah. And what's your take on Harris not getting elected, and many people obviously blaming Palestinians and suggesting that that created a divide between Black Americans and Palestinian Americans, for example? Was that just a strategy by the racists to divide us, to sort of implement that or inculcate that within our head or mind?
Well, one thing I will say is, I think it was the New York Times that broke a story, I believe last year, about a social media project that the Netanyahu administration created, in which they essentially recruited a number of trolls, particularly Israeli trolls, to really flood the social media sphere with all sorts of attacks on Palestinians, as well as defenses of the Israeli war, as well as justifications for the genocide. The reason why I bring this up is because I can remember on my own page, when I would post about Palestine, that there would be trolls who would attack me in ways that were trying to divide me from Palestinians. And they typically were coming using leftist language to do so. I'm mentioning that because I don't think that we fully understand how much the emotions and the feelings between groups was manufactured by nefarious actors, particularly on social media.
Yeah, can you unpack that a little bit more? How was it manufactured exactly?
I think what I mean by manufactured is that you had trolls on social media who literally were posing as Black people and attacking Palestinian activists and voices as somehow trying to sort of undermine the election of Kamala Harris. And then you had Black users who were then inflamed or enraged, by that troll, right? On the flip side of that, you had trolls who were posing as Palestinians who were attacking Black voices, particularly Black voices supporting Kamala Harris, who were then saying that, they support genocide. And then you, of course, had people who were upset about that, right? I'm mentioning this because I do think there was an incredibly important and robust debate, but there were so many trolls who were trying to create animosity between Black Americans and Palestinian Americans that it's hard to know where the constructive ended and the destructive began.
So you've been through a lot. I mean, you've been attacked, and yet you have had the courage to speak up for Palestine. You could have easily said it out, and I know internally that that's not who you are, but you could have said to yourself, you know what? I have a lot of haters. I have a lot of people coming my way. Maybe I should sit this one out. It's a huge inspiration. What motivated you to really step up here?
I think two things. I think first and foremost, when I think about the history of racism, one of the most insidious outgrowths of racism has been genocide. To witness the ways in which you had these Zionist voices justifying the genocide of Palestinians with racist ideas in forms that look so familiar to what had happened to other groups of peoples of color around the world, to not say anything when particularly that's my area of research, to me, it's just unthinkable. At the same time, while the genocide was happening, I was working on a book on Malcolm X, a biography of Malcolm X, particularly for young people. Malcolm X, of course, is one of the most influential Black Americans in history. And of course, he was an influential Black Muslim. And of course, he visited Gaza in '64 and he challenged Israeli Zionism. I wrote about that in Malcolm Lives. That's the title. I'm saying that to say part of it was even being inspired by Malcolm. He spoke out against Zionism when he had a lot of people who were coming at him, particularly the allies of Israel, the United States.
I'd argue you're still a little bit different. I mean, you battled stage 4 cancer. I believe your wife battled cancer as well. And with these attacks about your center, unfounded and uncalled for, you still did it. You still stepped up and you spoke up. How are you mentally and just health-wise? Because this is a lot of pressure for one person to take on.
Well, I'm good health-wise, I think. When you're surviving cancer, you would never really know until your next test. But everything is okay with me. My wife is doing really well. I think for me, to be frank, the attacks and even the allegations from people who I know are propagandists, who I know are trying to discredit and delegitimate our voices, I mean, that really did not bother me as much as the ways in which I've seen people in our own communities use similar talking points. And whether that was because they just hadn't really read my work, they didn't really want to be challenged on their viewpoints of different racial groups, or they just didn't like the attention my work was receiving, whatever it is, that's actually been the most painful part of the last few years.
Would you say that many people turn their back on you, close friends and colleagues possibly?
Not necessarily. I think there's certainly some people who may think I became quote unquote too controversial, right? And so we had a good personal relationship, but the people around them have issues for whatever reason with me. And so that certainly has happened at times, and that's certainly been unfortunate.
You're a humble guy. By the way, I'm pretty tall. You're much taller than me, so you're very tall. You're a humble guy. You seem to be more of an introvert. That's just my assumption, right? You could correct me if I'm
You're
wrong
correct.
there. How do you deal with this sudden fame? First, all the love in the world, right? That's the way it works, I guess. You get all the love in the world, and then you get this big hit of hate as well. How did you handle it being an introvert?
Oh, that was hard too, because I am most comfortable in a library, in an archive, reading a book, writing something. And so having to go on stage, it has been incredibly draining. I don't necessarily enjoy the spotlight. And it's because I'm an introvert. At the same time, because of my commitment to revolutionary change, I recognize that that's part of the process, that we all have to presumably do things we don't necessarily enjoy doing for the larger cause. Yeah, it's been a lot.
Yeah, no, I can definitely appreciate that. I want to talk about your book. You mentioned it, Malcolm Lives. By the way, I have every single one of your books. I mean, but we only have time to talk about Malcolm right now. If that's okay. You wrote it in short, swift chapters, like Malcolm's Fast Walk. That's just brilliant. How did you come up with that idea to take that approach?
I think as I was thinking about the book itself, I did not just want it to chronicle Malcolm's life. I wanted elements of even the way the book was constructed to chronicle who Malcolm was or what Malcolm did as a person. And so it came from there. I would also add that I think it reads very, very quickly, right? I wanted to ensure that this book was as accessible and interesting as possible for readers. So really quick chapters, I think we all like those.
Yeah. And what are the major themes of the book?
The major theme is certainly conveyed in the title, Malcolm Lives. And so the book really attempts to not only situate Malcolm in 1960, in 1964 as a young person, in 1935, but the book constantly resets chapters into the here and now so that we can see the way history is living, whether the history is living between the changed settings. Like, to give an example, there was a famous bar called Small's Paradise that Malcolm worked at in Harlem. So to narrate what it looked like then, but then also narrate that now the bar is not there and there's a school there, right? So people can sort of see how history moves, how history changes, but then also giving Malcolm the ability to speak to the here and now so that young people and older people can see what Malcolm would think about what we are facing today.
And I'm always curious as to the process. What inspired you to write this book? What was that aha moment? Like, I have an idea. I'm going to do this.
I think it's a combination of factors. I've long admired Malcolm's ability to speak to regular, everyday folks about the complexity of racism with analogies and language that anybody can understand. And so I've personally been inspired by him and the power and radicalism and sincerity and the unwillingness to be compromised. And so when I had this opportunity to work with the Malcolm X estate to create this biography, certainly it was not something that I could pass up.
And then is your daughter going to narrate this one as well, possibly?
Maybe. We'll see.
Okay. Well, my kids loved it. I highly encourage it if she does end up doing it. So talk about your center. And I know you're moving on from your current center to Howard. Talk about the decision behind that. And I know you've sort of always had Howard in your eyes or in your mind as a possible destination, if I understood correctly.
It was just that simple. I've been, in a way, talking to Howard on and off for years. And the opportunity really came together over the last year or so, and the opportunity to build this Institute for Advanced Study, that specifically will build an intellectual community at the nation's most prestigious, historically Black university that has one of the longest, if not the deepest, track record of studying racism and mobilizing students and faculty and thinkers to do so. It was just, something I couldn't pass up. We talked earlier about when did I start on this journey? It was in college, but not only any college, it was in HBCU, it was at FAMU. And so I feel like I'm, in a way, coming full circle.
So it's not because you wanted to be closer to busboys and poets and Andy, just to be clear.
Well, I mean, that always helps because, I did miss busboys and poets and of course, Andy.
There you go. What lessons are you taking from your previous center to this new initiative?
I think there are many, many lessons. I think one I'll just highlight now. Those of us who have led or tried to lead racial justice organizations, particularly over the last 5 years, we faced these sort of roller coasters of support. So, a tremendous amount of support. And then that amount of support declines tremendously. And, maybe at some point it'll increase. I'm clearly not as familiar with other fields, but I suspect there's few fields where the support for our organizations are so unstable. And so one of the learnings that I take from my center at BU is we have to plan for the instability. So one of the ways we're going to plan for the instability is through featuring a fellowship program that then allows us to bring in more or less fellows based on the amount of support we're receiving or lack thereof, as opposed to creating a situation where we have a number of staff, and if we don't meet a particular metric, we have to let people go. Trying to build an organization like that, particularly in this moment, is to me not sustainable. We certainly learned that from this experience.
And a question that doesn't get asked a lot of times is, how do we support you in this new initiative? What can we do to support you and best make sure that this is extremely successful and you get the full support needed?
I would encourage people to support any and every organization that is focused on racial justice. And that support could mean financial support. That support could be elevating the work. That support could be attending the events. That support could be defending that organization against untimely or bad faith attacks. Because I think our institute's going to be a part of a larger community of organizations that are going to be doing this work. And the more our community in general is uplifted, the better for us.
And I highly doubt this, but let's just assume somebody listens to this podcast and hears about you for the first time. If somebody wants to learn about Dr. Kendi, where do they start?
I would say if they want to learn about me, they probably should start with my book, Stamped from the Beginning, which was a narrative history of anti-Black racist ideas and in many ways provided the foundation, particularly the intellectual foundation for everything I did, everything I've done since then. Yeah, I would encourage people to start with Stamped from the Beginning.
Do you think we're going to see a movie about you possibly one day?
Oh, I don't know. I may be too shy for that.
I got to ask, if you do, who would you want to play you in a movie?
Oh, man, who would I want to play me? Depends on how old I was at the time. I mean, of course, I'm a fan of Michael B. Jordan. Yeah, I'd probably say Michael.
Okay, good deal. Any final messages or final message for the audience? Anything you would like to say to them or words of advice?
Well, I would say that I think in this moment, it can be challenging to believe that this sort of era that we're in is going to be permanent. But I just want to encourage people that there are many, many organizations and individuals who are fighting and thinking every day on their behalf to imagine and even create a world where we eliminate racism, where we end genocide, where we ensure everyone can return, can be free, can have their rights. These are the people that sort of fuel me each day.
So I've already pre-ordered your book, but just for the audience, where else can they get Malcolm Lives?
Yeah, so Malcolm Lives is available wherever books are sold. I would encourage anyone to maybe hop into your local independent bookstore. You can just go straight up to the front desk and say, hey, I want to pre-order Malcolm Lives. And they could do so and it'll arrive and they'll probably give you a call. But yeah, Malcolm Lives, at your local independent bookstore.
So if you're okay with it, I'm going to ask our guests, the first 10 guests that email us requesting the book, we're going to give them a free copy. So they email feedback@sumudpod.com. We will order the book and ship it to you. Are you okay with that?
I'm cool with that. Thank you so much.
I appreciate it. It's been a great honor. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Listen, stay tuned, cause it's time for Sumud.